Hello, I'm Robin. Welcome to Bookspin. Today I'd like to talk about Cats in Space and Other Places, edited by Bill Fawcett, published in 1992. The ultimate anthology of cat-themed science fiction. So, this is a really interesting collection, I think. We've got 16 stories in here, plus one poem. And these are SF short stories for the most part, with a smattering of fantasy, all featuring cats in one way or another. There's quite a lot of variety in here. There is a lot to enjoy. But as is the case with most anthologies, there is a bit of variation in quality. So I'm going to go through each of these stories in turn and share my thoughts on each of them. Before I go ahead, though, I'll just say that the first thing that disappointed me about this book is that there is no editor's introduction, which I think all good anthologies deserve to have. So it'd be nice to get some context to each of the stories and the authors and why they were chosen for this collection. So that was a missed opportunity, I think. The only hint that we get at any kind of context for these stories is the fact that the book is divided into two sections, which you can see here on the contents page. Cats, followed by alien cats. Anyway, let's take a look at the stories. So the story that opens up the collection is The Game of Rat and Dragon by Cordwainer Smith, which is an absolute classic, one of Smith's best known and best loved stories, and I would argue is the definitive feline sci-fi short story. I've read this one a few times before. I've reviewed it previously on this channel in its own video, so I don't want to retread old ground here, but in a nutshell, this is a story about telepathic cats who get assigned human partners to defend starships against attacks from these interstellar monsters known as the dragons, which the cats visualize as rats, hence the story title. Now, if you've never read Cordwainer Smith before, this story, I think, is a great showcase to his weird and wonderful world building, and his rich imagination is absolutely worth the read and a great story to open the volume with. The second story is called Mouse by Frederick Brown, which was another reread for me. In this story, a man witnesses the arrival of a mysterious alien spaceship from his apartment window and theorizes what's going on in front of his cat. So this is quite entertaining. It's got a nice twist at the end, but I do think that there are much better Frederick Brown short stories out there. But it's a fun little story. This one is followed by Ship of Shadows by Fritz Leiber, and this is quite a long one. It's one of the longest short stories in this volume at 50 pages. I think it was. It's also really bizarre. We follow a severely visually impaired bartender working on a spaceship who develops a friendship with a talking cat. All the while, a lurking horror, a threat emerges from within the crew. This story is a little strange. It's a little difficult to read. The writing style is pretty confusing and hard to follow. And Leiber throws in all kinds of unfamiliar terms into the descriptions and the world building, and he kind of leaves it up to the reader to kind of guess what they mean, which makes it a little bit frustrating to read some of the time. And it reminds me a little bit of Gene Wolfe in some ways. Ultimately, it's quite a good story, but it wasn't my favourite. The next one is called Schrödinger's Cat by Ursula K. Le Guin, which is a short philosophical tale that explores the classic thought experiment with a cat. Not bad, but it doesn't really add anything new. If you're already familiar with how the paradox works of Schrödinger's cat. This is a pretty short one. It's pretty forgettable, to be honest. A bit disappointing for a Le Guin story. This story was followed by Tales of a Starship's Cat by Judith R. Conley, which is not actually a story, but a poem about the life of a cat on a spaceship. It's quite a charming little poem, but it's not very long. And poems aren't really something I look for in an anthology, but it's not bad for what it is. Next up, Who's There by Arthur C. Clarke, which is not a very long story, but it is very entertaining. So in this story, an astronaut working on a space station orbiting Earth goes out on a spacewalk before experiencing some rather strange and unsettling phenomena. Now, to reveal how cats are involved in this story would be a spoiler. So this is a short but suspenseful story with a fantastic ending. This one is followed by Bullhead by David Drake. This is a bit of a weird one, and unfortunately it wasn't to my taste. It's basically a kind of historical fantasy set in the American Old West, featuring a wizard and a talking mule, along with a few other talking animals. Now, I had a lot of problems with this story. First, it was kind of boring. Second, it was too long, like 40 pages, which doesn't sound very much, but when a story's this dull, it's a slog, basically. Third, it felt out of place. The historical fantasy / Western vibe just doesn't seem right in here, in a book called Kzin Space. Fourth, Drake uses a peculiar style of dialogue, which is a little confusing. That all the characters speak in this really weird dialect, which I suppose is supposed to give it some kind of historical authenticity, but I found it very hard to understand what the characters were saying a lot of the time. Finally, and most egregiously, it's not a cat story at all. Okay, there is a cat in the story. It's actually a talking cat, along with a bunch of other talking animals. But the cat only has a very small role. In fact, if you take away the cat, it doesn't affect the story in any way. So that is the ultimate sin in including this story in a cat-themed collection. Anyway, rant over, let's move on. The next story is Ordeal in Space by Robert A. Heinlein. This was a surprisingly gripping story from the 1940s about a former astronaut who is suffering from severe acrophobia and a sort of PTSD after a traumatic episode he experienced in space. Now, back on Earth, he has to face his fears when he finds a kitten stuck on the ledge of a tall apartment building, and this drama unfolds. It's an engaging, well-written and heartwarming tale. And then we have another Fritz Leiber story called Space-Time for Springers. This one, I'm pleased to say, is a lot more accessible than the previous Leiber story. It's still pretty weird, though. I would also say that this story is more fantasy than SF, but that is forgivable because it's a sweet story written in quite an endearing way from a feline point of view, and it's about a kitten who believes that he will grow up into a human. It's got a strangely sad and poignant ending, even though nobody dies or anything. And then we have a very short story called The Tale by M.J. Eng, which is only 3 pages long, which I would say is another non-SF story. I'm not even sure what to call it. It's debatable whether it would even classify as fantasy. Anyway, this is a first-person account of a cat who faces an unsettling situation when they believe their tail has taken on a life of its own. Is it just a delusion, or is something weirder going on? Not a bad story for its length. Okay, now from here on out, we are back into pure sci-fi territory. Starting with Well Worth the Money by Jodie Lynn Nye, which was a definite hidden gem in this collection. I'd never heard of this author before, but this was an incredibly entertaining story, and it really lives up to the book title Cats in Space, because this story centres around a cat that accompanies a crew on a space mission that unwittingly gets involved in an interstellar conflict. And the cat plays a critical role in the way events unfold. The cat itself is just an ordinary domestic cat. It's not a telepathic cat or a talking cat or uplifted intelligence or anything like that, but it still has a remarkably heroic role in the story. So it's a clever concept, it's entertaining, with a definite feel-good feel to it. This is the kind of story that anyone can enjoy. And this particular story concludes the first half of the book, the cat's half. The second section is called Alien Cats, and most of the stories that follow feature cat people in one form or another. So this starts off with Chanur's Homecoming by C.J. Cherryh, which, according to the copyright information at the beginning of the book, this is actually an excerpt from a novel, chapter 12 of Chanur's Homecoming, which itself is book 4 of a 5-book series, which seems a bit of a weird choice. And as soon as I saw where this story came from, it was a bit of a red flag. This series seems to be a military sci-fi epic featuring intelligent, feline-like people, kind of race called the Hani. Kind of like bipedal lions, I guess, from the book cover imagery. Anyway, unfortunately, this excerpt was, I think, an awful choice to put in this book. It was utterly confusing, hard to follow. The pacing is ridiculously fast. There are tons of characters and new terminology that gets thrown around all over the place with no context or explanation. This was seriously painful to read. Now, I've never read C.J. Cherryh before, and maybe this excerpt isn't doing her justice. After all, you wouldn't expect to, say, give Tolkien a try just by reading one random chapter from The Return of the King with no context. That's not the way to sample an author, right? But the quality of writing in here wasn't exactly inspiring for me to check out more of her work. This is by far the worst story in this collection. Fortunately, everything that follows this is pretty good. The next story is called Duty Calls by Anne McCaffrey. And like the C.J. Cherryh text, we get some more military sci-fi that's part of a wider universe. In this case, the Duna series. But this is a much better read. It features an intelligent, cat-like alien race called the Hruban that walks on all fours. And this story has quite a bit of adventure and intrigue. It's an engaging story. This was followed by Black Destroyer by A.E. Van Vogt. And this is one of the stories that I talked about in my recent Feline Frontier video. I do think it's one of the highlights of this collection. It's an intense sci-fi horror tale featuring a cat-like antagonist on another planet that has tendrils coming out of its head that function as both ears and kind of prehensile appendages. Anyway, we follow this creature as it goes on a murderous rampage against the human explorers on its planet and attempts to outwit them and hunt them down. So this is a horrific and compelling tale and one of the best Van Vogt stories that I've ever read. I've only ever read his short stories. I've not actually tried any of his novels yet. This is followed by The Pride by Todd Hamilton and P.J. Beese. Again, not authors I've heard of before. This is a palace drama featuring a lion man, cyborg protagonist with a metal hand who is head of the Imperial Guard on this world. The quality of writing in this story is pretty good, with engaging world building which hints that this is just one small part of an epic story. But the story ends in quite an abrupt way, which doesn't give a very satisfying narrative closure. And to me, it feels very much like the opening chapter to a novel rather than a self-contained story. So I looked up these authors, and it turns out that they did indeed write a full novel featuring this character. It's called The Guardsman. And from the blurb, it sounds like the story that I read is an extract from this novel, but I couldn't find confirmation of this anywhere. So maybe the short story eventually became a novel. I don't know. And then we get the penultimate story, in which Cordwainer Smith returns for the Ballad of Lost Camel, and this story introduces the beautiful cat girl Camel, who plays quite a big role in Smith's novel Norstrilia. And this is the tale of her secret conspiracy working with the human Lord Jestercost to gain rights for the animal-derived underpeople, of which she's a member, and her unrequited love with this man. So there's some interesting world building in this one, but I do think there are better Cordwainer Smith stories out there. Personally, I think it's a pity that they didn't include The Crime and the Glory of Commander Suzdal, which is another one of his stories, in this collection, because that story also features cats, and it's a real mind-bender of a story, one of his very best, I think. Now, the story that closes this book is called The Man Who Would Be Kzin by Greg Bear and S.M. Sterling. This is a military sci-fi novella, and it's the longest story in this collection, and once again features a race of bipedal cat humanoids, the Kzinti. So these are an imperialistic alien species developed by Larry Niven originally, with multiple authors contributing to this fictional universe in a series called The Man-Kzin Wars. The Kzinti are a highly macho, patriarchal civilization, and in the backdrop to this story, they are preparing an invasion of Earth. Now, this is the story of a man from Earth who is sent to infiltrate an enemy ship, telepathically disguised as a Kzin, which is a pretty intriguing concept, I think. It's a decent story to finish the collection on. And there we have it. Those are all the stories. Overall, it's an enjoyable collection to read, barring a couple of stinkers and a couple of mediocre stories. The rest were all enjoyable to read, with particular highlights in Cordwainer Smith, Jody Lynn Nye, A.E. Van Vogt, and Robert Heinlein. I'm going to give Cats in Space and Other Places an overall rating of 3 stars. Now, if there was a decent preface or introductions to these stories, I think that would improve it somewhat, and I would give it a higher rating. But it's still an entertaining collection overall. That's all for today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon.